HistoryNet and Mr.Brass are interviewing the biochemist Garte. How's life treating you, sir?
Very well, thank you.
Nice to have you on, Cy.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Tell us about your background. You said you were raised communist?
Yes. Well, I wasn't raised communist. I was raised by my parents were communists, but they didn't tell me that. That would have been very dangerous in those days. I'm a boomer baby. I was born right after the war, and the 1950s was not a good time for to have a kid, you know, pre-adolescent running around saying, "No, Comrade Stalin is a good guy." You know, that wouldn't have really worked well. So they never really admitted that they were communists, but I found out later that they had been. And of course, I absorbed much of the philosophy, including a very strong level of atheism, which among communists is not simply we don't believe in God. It's, you know, God is a impossible fiction, evil religion, especially Christianity is the worst thing that's ever afflicted humanity, and that was sort of the philosophy I grew up with, and held myself for some time. Are we
Interesting.
frozen? Oh,
It's
okay.
nice. Yeah, it's nice actually being able to hear about that. Because I'm currently I have a couple books on communism, trying to learn about what their relationship with religion was and what they had planned overall.
hmm
So, I mean, what got you into science?
hmm Well, I mean, my father was a scientist. He was a very strong philosophical materialist. That was also part of the dialectic of the left. Science, Marx was supposed to be a scientist, and Marx himself, of course, wrote about, as did Lenin, wrote about science as the hope of mankind. So I was pretty much indoctrinated with the wonders of science, but I really loved it. It went well with my own internal ways of thinking. And when I got to school, I was very interested in history, but I couldn't figure out what I would do with myself as a historian. I didn't know if there were jobs for historians. And so I ended up choosing, well, first I thought I would go into medicine, but then I didn't like that. The pre-med experience was pretty bad, so I switched to biochemistry, and that's where I got my degree. And
Nice.
I'm
I
happy I
remember.
did.
Yeah, yeah. I remember. Evolution was always a big thing talked about in communism, from what I can tell. And
hmm
although the kind of evolution that people like Stalin promoted wouldn't be something that any reputable scientist would hold to today, because he was what's the word for it? I know he didn't believe in genetics, or of
Yeah.
course I can't remember what they called it.
Well, there was a guy named Lysenko who
Uh,
was
Yeah,
your
Lamarckian.
yeah,
Lamarckian,
that's what it
right?
is.
Yeah, a version of Lamarckian. Lysenko was a fraud, professor of genetics in the Soviet Union, who promoted some very weird ideas about crop growth, which contributed to some extent to the terrible, starvations and famines that swept Russia in the 20s and 30s. But he was able to convince Stalin that his idea was very much in line with communism because it suggested that there would be a way to improve people's lives, which would then be passed down to their children. So if workers were living in a better way, had more positive attributes because of a better life, they would be genetically passed down. So Stalin was convinced that this was the answer to a lot of the problems in Russia. And the tragedy of that was not so much that it was wrong, which clearly was, but it really ended up destroying Russian biology until I mean, it began to recover in the 90s. That's how bad it was, because there were no biologists in the Soviet Union. All the good ones had either been killed or fled. And even molecular biology was very slow to take over there as a result. So it was pretty tragic for Russian science. And it's a good lesson for science and social science in general, that uh, political ideas and even religious ideas, any kind of ideas that are not scientific, don't really go well with the scientific enterprise, especially political ideas. So it's an argument I've often made when people these days talk about certain ideas which are really coming from politics, and then they say, like Bill Nye is famous for saying, it's science, and it's not science. It's a poor excuse, and it's just politics.
And nihilist DeGrasse Tyson.
Yeah, I have some respect for him, but I think his Cosmos show was really a travesty, and I don't know why.
I think it was good in some areas. It's good in many areas, but also terrible in when it tried to portray history and the church's relationship with science.
Yeah, it's the standard, mythology that that Bruno was burnt at the stake because he was promoting a scientific view, which is nonsense. Bruno was complete scientific fraud. But anyway,
Galileo and Kepler were like, "Thank God that nutcase is dead."
Yeah, exactly. That's right. So anyway, but there's a lot of mythology which I swallowed when I was young, because what else would I know? I thought that even though the rest of the country was going through a very strong anti-communist phase, I thought that my family and a few of their friends and a few of the people who were fellow travelers are in the same position. They've come to be called red diaper babies, the kids who were born to communists from the 30s, that we knew the truth, okay, and nobody else really understood anything. They were all being brainwashed by the capitalist press, and we knew the reality, which is that communism would eventually prevail and everyone would be happy. So when people ask me if I was ever brainwashed into Christianity, when they don't know anything about me and they hear I'm a Christian, they say, well, that's probably because you were brainwashed into Christianity as a child. And my answer is, you're half right. I was brainwashed, but not into Christianity.
Speaking of which, tell us your story. Like, how did you find God, and what led you to be a Christian?
Yeah, that's a long story, and I have written it up in a book. It's going to be published in the fall. It's called The Works of His Hands. It'll be published in November. I just finished the final edits, and it's now undergoing everything that the publisher has to do with it. So I'm not advertising it a lot yet because it's not ready for pre-order. So once that happens, though, I will be promoting it and talking about it. And that book is subtitled A Scientist's Journey from Atheism to Faith. And it tells my whole story. And the story involves a lot of science, and I spend several chapters talking about, it's not a textbook, but I talk about some of the aspects of physics and biology that are not what people think they are, and that when I began learning these things, I started realizing that atheism did not make any sense at all. It just didn't mesh, because you see, the kind of atheism that I followed was also very anti-spiritual, which is part of the communist ethic. There's a denial of any form of spirituality whatsoever, and it's highly materialistic and highly reductionist. And of course, that doesn't fit with modern science. We've known for a long time, but it only slowly catches on to the public, that the results of 20th century physics and quantum mechanics and relativity and even particle physics, just they're not what anyone in the 19th century would have imagined. Anyone who followed the the mechanistic view of nature would have been horrified to hear about things like the uncertainty principle or any of the other advances in physics. So that made me think, well, wait a minute, this doesn't sound that rational to me. It certainly doesn't sound reasonable. It's definitely not materialistic. So what is going on here? This, because it's true. I mean, quantum mechanics is certainly true. That's why we're talking, for example. And I mean, so I started wondering about that, and I eventually decided, because of other things, just regular life, I decided that, well, ruling out all spirituality really doesn't make sense. I mean, how come people feel emotional when they hear music or when they see something beautiful? How do they fall in love and all that stuff, that obvious stuff, made me think that no, it's not just pure materialism. And we're not just, I always get amused when I get a response to one of my tweets from one of my many, many atheist fans who say, we're just molecules. Well, that's
We're just
nonsense.
insignificant specks of stardust in an uncaring universe filled with random tragedy.
There you go. Well, the stardust thing is funny. That was Sagan's attempt at being spiritual. He would kind of look off into the distance and say, we are stardust.
Billions and billions.
Right. So, that never made an impression on me. Being stardust doesn't matter. What does that even mean? But I did start to feel that there must be something more, as I once heard John Walton say, that it's not just, very simple and reductionist. There's something else going on. And I felt that was a rational way to think. I didn't know about God. I didn't know much about it. I never read anything about it. I began looking a little bit into it. I started thinking about God. If God could exist, I started reading some stuff. And then I read the Gospels, which really struck me because, I had heard of Jesus Christ, not much. But when you actually read the Gospels, if you've never read them before, they're incredible. I mean, they're amazing because, this story doesn't sound made up. I mean, there's no way. I don't know who could possibly come up with this story.
I'll just remember, sorry, Jesus never existed. He was invented by Paul.
Yeah. I know. Fine.
I mean, that's something I believe the communists also taught.
I don't know if that's true. The version it may be true in some places, but the version I heard,
regionally popular in the Soviet Union.
The version I heard, though, was a little bit more, how would you put it, more touchy-feely. It was kind of, Jesus was because remember that Jesus said a lot of things that the commies liked, right? He said,
sharing
wealth. He said a rich man won't get into heaven. He said all these good socialist stuff. And so what I heard was that he was a teacher the religious establishment crucified him because he was teaching rebellion against the established order and et cetera. So in other words, they made him into a communist saint, sort of. Now, I don't know if that was popular everywhere in the world or it was the American version. I don't know. The communists were very good at adapting their message to their local audience, and
must be an American thing. Like Jesus was a socialist.
Line. Exactly. There you go. Right. So I never heard this mythicism stuff before, and it's just so absurd on the face of it that I don't even. To me, it's like flat Earth. I don't even want to talk about it. It's so stupid. It's just ridiculous. So people argue with Carrier, and I think, what's the point? I mean, the man it's not serious.
He should kind of stroke his dick the whole time, bragging about how he has a PhD from Columbia.
Yeah, he has a PhD, and that's true. Having a PhD, although I wish it weren't the case, does not make you immune from stupidity, so
It's
or
Well,
ignorance is
Kent
what
better
you,
Hovind
better way
also
to
has
put it.
a PhD.
huh?
Kent Hovind also has a PhD.
Well,
Yeah, but he is at a diploma mill.
I actually read his thesis. I will say no more.
Well, I mean, he has a book out now.
Of course he
So there's
does.
that.
He has a lot of books now. I think he puts out a book a month.
I mean, I just heard about one because some atheist named, I believe, Rachel Oates
Hmm.
said that she
Yeah,
did a review of it. So that was the only one I heard of.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
She's one of the good ones.
yeah, there are some of them out there, and there's a lot of none that are not. So I'm trying to think. Uh, hmm. I remember you when you took on King Crocoduck, you sort of blew everyone's expectations away because they were expecting it to be such a dogmatic battle between two people, and you and King Crocoduck got along the entire time.
Yeah,
Yeah, I tend to. I don't know. I have this problem of I don't know. I mean, I'm a pretty good fighter, but maybe it's because I'm getting older. I don't know. But actually, the fact is that we agreed, and all of this. You know how it started. Our good dear mutual friend Dean had gotten on a program with King Crocoduck
oh yeah,
and made a simple mistake, which he realized later that he had made the mistake, and that was he confused methodological with philosophical naturalism, and he was insisting that science does not and should not use methodological naturalism, and I don't know, it, he just got confused for a minute.
his mistake is that he can't debate.
Sorry,
His
I
mistake is that
started.
he can't debate.
Yeah. So at that point, this was non sequitur. I think that was my first appearance on non sequitur show. Actually, Steve asked me to come on and debate whether or not science uses methodological naturalism, as if I was going to say no. Of
Yeah,
course it
and
does.
you agreed on 90% of the topic.
Yeah, yeah, we didn't have too much to disagree on. And King Crocoduck is a atheist, but he is not among the variety that we often encounter these days. He's a
Yeah,
very smart young man and knows a huge amount of stuff, science as well as other things. And we really had a good time.
like
And sorry, go ahead.
like does it frustrate or amuse you that village atheists, as I call anti-theists, like
Hmm.
they feel the need to lecture you on how science works?
Yeah, it does amuse me. It doesn't bother me. It's funny when you're actually. I mean, I was a practicing experimental laboratory scientist. I've done hundreds of experiments. I've published hundreds of papers. I really do know about science, and um, it's a little frustrating because very few people who don't do it really don't understand it. So, when they talk about falsifiability and they talk about, all of the standard philosophical arguments that were brought up originally, I guess, by people like Sam Harris and Hitchens and a few others about how science works. By the way, none of them did any science either. I know Harris
Well,
published a paper or two,
Sam
but
Harris
barely.
only wrote like two papers with his
Yeah, something
PhD,
like that. Yeah, yeah.
and
Uh, he decided he was an atheist who decided, gee, I'll have more credibility if I get a PhD. So he went back and he got a PhD in what he calls neuroscience, which is basically psychology. Wrote a couple of papers, and now he's a PhD scientist.
Remember before all that, he spent a decade in India doing drugs and used
Yeah,
his mother's his mother's money for Golden Girls and used that to get into school and get his PhD.
yeah. I don't know those details, but I don't have a huge amount of, I mean, respect for him as a scientist. I think he's a smart guy sometimes, and he says some smart things, but a lot of things that aren't. But my point is that when it comes to the actual practice and means of science, there's a huge amount of ignorance out there. And one of the things I'm going to actually, I tweet a lot, and I'm going to be tweeting very shortly some definitions. For example, proof, evidence,
Yeah.
theory, research. That's a great one. Whenever I see somebody say, I've done my research, I cringe.
Research trademark.
Yeah. So I want to define all those things so that when people use them, like they say, prove your God exists. I mean, that's just so silly. It's just meaningless. And that's not evidence. You know, people will say that's not evidence, and yes, it is.
Yeah.
You don't know what evidence is.
You can predict what they're going to say.
Yeah, it's very predictable.
Like, I find them paying lip service to science, reason, and logic, all that disturbing, but also hilarious. Like when our mutual friend Paulo Gia tried to lecture Sarah Salviander on cosmology or something, even though she's a bona fide astrophysicist with a PhD.
Yeah. Well, Paul is the least bad, I must say, of many.
And then she pointed out that he became an atheist because of Ken Ham, and then they got
he was very devout Christian until fairly recent. I don't remember, a couple of years maybe. I don't want to say what's wrong, but he was pretty devout, and then he lost it. But he and I have had some interesting discussions, nothing in great depth. Maybe we'll get to do that sometime. I wouldn't mind talking to him, live, but we'll see if that happens. Because I think he's a pretty smart guy, and I think he's searching. This is not true of many others.
He's also pretty committed to atheism. Like, atheism is my passion. And
he is now. Yes, he is now.
Well, I mean, how can you be passionate about a lack of belief?
Yeah, I don't get that. That's a good question.
Hey, I'm passionate about
I mean, it's sort of like being passionate about being a non-golfer.
Well, that kind of fits me, actually. It only comes up on rare occasions.
Like, given your position, would you say that young Earth creationism is a heresy?
No, because I don't like to use that word, and it's and I don't like to use it because I'm a pretty good scientist. I'm a terrible theologian. I know very little theology. Whenever I try to talk about theology, I get myself in trouble because, and I would rather defer to people like, Robert Rowe or Inspiring Philosophy, Michael Jones, the people who really know this stuff.
So the science,
and I just don't. So I don't like the term heretic because it's very loaded. What I do think about Ken Ham and people like, Kent Hovind, I don't remember which one you said, but with Kent, what I tried to tell him in my debate with him a few months ago was that it's not even a question of whether he's right or I'm right. The question is, what are we doing to the church? Now, his view is that people like me who espouse evolution to some extent and old Earth are harming the church because we're not really preaching the gospel. I think the evidence is the other way. And the reason that I'm doing anything at all, including tweeting and blogging and writing a book and talking to you guys and everything else, my motivation for that is simple, and it's easily stated as I want people to understand that science, and I'm not talking about fake science, but mainstream, regular, ordinary science that's real, is not in conflict with Christian faith. It simply isn't. And the biggest lie that I know of in the last 100-odd years is that it is a conflict. And this lie has been perpetuated by so many people. And you mentioned Tyson, he's one. But there are so many others who perpetuate this, obviously Dawkins and his crew, but even some more mainstream scientists perpetuate this, and a lot of Christians do. And that's the last thing we should be doing. When Kent Hovind says evolution is a religion and there's no evidence for it, and either if you're going to be a Christian, you have to reject that. Well, he's turning off thousands of students and young
Yeah,
people who have been convinced that biology is a real science and their professors are telling the truth and the books are correct and they've done their own experiments. And so if they have that choice, they're not going to choose the church and they're fleeing and the evidence is there.
that's why we.
So,
That's why I declare Ken Ham and Ken Hopeman heretics.
well, you may be right. Again, I think they're bad for the church, and it may
Well,
be because they're preaching a heresy. I don't know.
I mean,
Sorry.
when we go into the Middle Ages and stuff, like a heretic wasn't just someone that had a false belief. A
Mm-hmm.
heretic was someone that had a false belief, knew that they had a false belief even after being corrected on it, and then
Mm.
continued to preach about it even
I'm
Interesting.
after being corrected.
I'm kind of skeptical of if either of them are know that they're selling crap or they're just legitimately confused.
I don't know. I think. I mean, with talking to Kent, both in the debate and before and after, I have the sense he's not putting it on. I mean, I think he definitely has a large following that he satisfies, but I think he really believes it, and I'm willing to say fine. You can believe what you want. It doesn't bother me. I don't think it hurts anyone to believe in young Earth creationism. It's not an evil thing. But what I do find reprehensible are the suggestions, and it comes more from somebody like Ken Ham than anyone else, that those who don't hold to their interpretation of Scripture, and it is an interpretation, it's not literal, that those people are heretics or are harming the church or are not really Christian. When I hear that, I get very upset. I don't like that because it's not true.
Yeah,
And
like I remember.
I would just like with some atheists, I have a lot of followers. I would say more than with atheists who are very adamant young Earth creationists. Many of them argue with me, try to convince me. As far as I know, only one has unfollowed me because he just can't stand what I say, and I don't
Like
say it very much. But
like when you got lunatics on both sides screeching about how wrong you are, you must be doing something right.
yeah, that's right. Because evolutionary creationism, which is sort of roughly what I'm in, somewhere between that and ID, uh, but definitely old Earth. Uh, you know, we're all of us, and there's a lot of us, by the way. In fact, it's the majority of Christians if you read the surveys right. Um, we're kind of on this cliff or promontory between two chasms. One is young Earth creationism, and the other is atheism, and we're
And
kind of fighting on two fronts in a way.
yeah, and biblical literalism was a 19th century invention, apparently.
Yeah, by Seventh Day Adventism.
Yep.
That's where it came from. And when I mentioned that to Kent Hovind, he got unhappy. He didn't like that.
Well,
He's
of
heard it
course,
before,
you
of
know the
course.
Bible was written in the King's English.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. If it's
Yeah,
good enough for King James, it's good enough for us.
The you said theology wasn't your strong suit, but it's the scientific implications that lead you to God.
Well, it was the scientific implications that led me to think that God was possible. It was reading the Gospels that led me to think that Jesus Christ, as God incarnate on earth, was a brilliant idea for God to have. I mean, how does God communicate other than through prophets with his people? And it's a great idea for him to show up on earth and just tell us stuff. And what he told us was revolutionary, radical, and we still can't do it. We say the words, but you really love all your enemies? I know I don't. I try. It's hard. So, I kind of got convinced by the Gospels about God because when I began to see that Jesus Christ was possibly real, that was a real, a real person who died and maybe was actually resurrected, I began thinking, yeah, maybe I'm a Christian. But I couldn't get there all the way because all of this was thinking, reading, philosophizing, wondering, uh, and that didn't do it for me because I still had so much of that baggage from my youth that kept saying, no, 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 this is all, make believe. It can't be real. And I don't think I would have ever actually taken the final leap if it hadn't been for an event which I refer to and describe in great detail in my book, which is I was visited by the Holy Spirit, and the experience lasted about half an hour. And when it was over, um, I was driving at the time. I had to pull over, and I went through an extremely emotional experience because I knew that I had been touched by God, and I knew that I was now a Christian, and that was about 15 years ago. And that wasn't the end because I was not part of a church. I'd never been baptized. I didn't know how you actually be a Christian. And however, eventually I did join a church. I was baptized in 2012, and here I am.
What would you
Yeah.
say was the best scientific implication for God, like on scientifically speaking?
Well, I could repeat some of the things that William Lane Craig says. I mean, the fact that we're here, that there is a universe, that we are in fact sentient beings, which is another incredible miracle. Why should there be sentient beings in the universe? Uh, but I will say that the first thing that really struck me, and I've used it occasionally when people say, "Show your proof of God," and I write down the Heisenberg uncertainty formula. Um, which of course is not proof of God. But when I first learned it, I said to myself, wait a minute, okay, this is true physics. It cannot be disputed. It will never be changed. It will never be overthrown. It's the basis of so much. And it's basically telling us there are things we can never know. We can never, theoretically, in principle, ever be able to determine the position and the momentum of an electron at the same time. If we could, there would be no radioactivity, there would be no solar energy. So, that has to be true. And that's kind of like, whoa. So science cannot tell everything because we already know this one example, and of course I think there are many other things. And so that that's pretty strong evidence to me that the universe is not a simple machine that works just like any other machine, and you can dissect it and understand every part of it, and you can take it apart and put it back together. No, it's not that way. So why is it the way it is? Why is there randomness? Why is there chaos? Why is there free will? Why is determinism a ridiculous philosophical concept, at least in my view? And I think, that to me, that was the first pointer to God. Now, we don't talk about proof of God, and it's even hard to talk about evidence because, I think there is evidence for God, but one word that's often used, I first heard it from Francis Collins, is pointer. There are things that point to God, that point to a creator, that point to a being who is, transcendent. And as I said, some of those things are in biology. The incredible complexity of cells, which goes way back to almost the very beginning of life. Some of those things could not really have evolved, in my view. And even the beginning of evolution, how did that happen? How did life learn how to evolve? That's a whole mechanism. It's a mechanism of biochemistry, which is incredibly complex. So all of that, I think, is evidence. But frankly, as I said, what had to convince me that I am going to call myself a Christian and I'm going to speak, write, and work for the sake of Christ was my experience with the Holy Spirit, which was direct, personal, and undeniable.
Okay. Like speaking on evolution, like I think I remember you acknowledged the existence of Adam and Eva. Like Bible bashers often assume that if you accept evolution, that automatically means that there was no Adam and Eva, which is strange considering that nearly every culture has the collective memory of a quote unquote first man and woman. Like,
Hmm.
would you say they were the first behaviorally modern humans or something like that? Like, when do you suppose they would have lived?
Well, you could. I mean, I think here's where things get really complicated because there's the biblical account, which, as you said, is a story. It's probably based on truth. We know that humans in their body evolved from earlier primates, uh, but that isn't what makes us human. I mean, if you think about what makes us human, it's not that we, have arms and walk around and have opposable thumbs. That's not a big deal. What makes us human is everything that we do that nothing else comes close to. We think, we talk on the internet, we create, we have art, we have music, we have science, we have all this stuff we have language. Let's start with that. Where do we get all that? Well, what you'll hear is, well, we got it from evolution because it's better for an animal to be able to talk than not. Well, I don't know. That's first of all, that's not even true. Okay, it's not better for an animal to be able to talk about, the profundities of philosophical issues. It's probably better for an animal to say things like ugh, lion there, run. I mean, that's probably better than, well, let's discuss this a little and see what we really want to do. That probably wasn't a selective advantage. So, and second of all, this idea that evolution explains everything in humanity is what we call a just so story. I mean, you can come up with any story. I came up with an example once, which was, why is it that when you're really scared you urinate? And I came up with the answer. Oh, it's very easy. When you're being dragged away by a large animal, urination is very smelly, and will disgust the animal, and he'll decide he doesn't want to eat you. That sounds logical, right?
Hmm?
But it's because it's nonsense. I just made it up. It's not real. I
Yeah.
mean, you can come up with all kinds of stories as to why we are the way we are. Now, sometimes they're correct. I mean, perhaps it's certainly true that if adults, and I'm not just talking about humans, but any animal, if they didn't take care of their children, their babies and their infants, the species would go extinct very quickly. So, yeah, you can imagine an evolutionary pressure to do that, to have maternal care and et cetera. But it's not all or nothing. There are some things that are probably evolutionary based. But Beethoven didn't owe any of his genius to evolution. I don't believe. I believe that Beethoven and Einstein and even the three of us owe whatever we can point to that makes us human to the simple fact that we were created in God's image. And the story that's most important is that God breathed a soul into Adam, and that soul is what makes us human. And it says it right there in Genesis. So now, was there really a guy who may or may not have been called Adam who lived at a particular point?
Probably wasn't his
And,
real
sorry?
name. Most probably, definitely wasn't his real name.
Yeah, I mean, Adam means man. So, no, I don't know, and I don't think it matters. I don't think the lesson of Genesis is that there were two people made out of earth, and there was no one else before that, and everything else was an animal. And it doesn't matter. That's not the point. The point is God created humanity in His image, and in His image means everything that we do. That's what, and
Yeah,
no other animal does. That's why we have Imago Dei. Sorry, I'm sorry.
creativity, individuality, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean everything. Creativity,
Well, I
you
mean,
name it, mathematics.
just remember who was Cain's wife.
Well, yeah, I mean there's a lot that points. I mean even the actual original text, and as I said, I'm not a theologian, but I did spend some time looking into the original text of that passage, it doesn't say that the text does not say that Adam was the first man at all. It just says that he was the only one around who could till the land. He could be a farmer. So and yeah, what about who was Cain's wife and who built the city that he was living in and Answers in Genesis has an answer to that, which is basically incest. Uh, so when they say they don't interpret, they just take the literal meaning. That's nonsense. They're interpreting as well.
But then they'll also point to there's people that will also point to that Dutch guy Walter or something like that, who concluded that that bonobos and chimpanzees have a moral ethical framework, quote
You're
unquote.
talking about DeWall.
Yeah.
Yeah, DeWall. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know. There are a lot of people. I know some. I mean, I know them professionally and personally who work with primates. Who basically, to hear them say it, they're like us, except they don't talk much. But I'm not convinced. I don't believe it. I never did. One thing that has not changed when I became a Christian is that I've always had the feeling that human beings were special in a way that was not well appreciated. I guess that you call that a humanist, and it's ironic to me that I think that the only humanists these days are the Christians. I mean, atheists are not humanists at all. What you'll hear from atheists, modern atheists, many times is we are insignificant. We're living on a insignificant, tiny planet in the middle of nothing. This is the most nonsensical argument I think I've ever heard.
Or just soulless meat machines that evolved in a random rock by chance.
Yeah, but the point is, they talk about the Earth being small. Who cares? I mean, does size matter? I mean, the planet you live on matters. What?
I said apparently to women it might.
Here's a quote by Richard Matheson: "Like with God, there is no zero."
Right.
I remember it's sort of trying to think. Yeah, I think it is just funny. It's like they'll use that whole argument where it's basically the universe is big, therefore there is no God. I'm like, what's the second premise?
There, all the wasted
Right.
space, and that 99% of the universe
Right.
is trying to kill us.
So I'm going to take this opportunity to plug a book. It's not my own book, but a book is just it's about to be released. It's by a guy named Daniel Ray. He's one of the editors, and Sarah Salviander, who I think you guys know, is one of the. She wrote an article in it. She has one of the. It's a collection of articles. It's called The Story of the Cosmos. It's published by Harvest House. It's going to be released, I think, in July. Anyway, Daniel just sent me a copy. It's a beautiful book, and it was basically written to counter this argument, which was made by the Cosmos show. So the story of the Cosmos is a counter argument to that, and talks about how, in fact, that whole argument of insignificance and random meaninglessness is just nonsense.
Well, I mean, what they fail to realize is that, a lot of, like, we can intuitively know that's like arguing that fish, actually, no, it's like arguing that a robot isn't designed because if you throw it into the ocean, it'll die. It's like,
I never heard that one.
yeah.
That's an argument?
No, I mean, that's sort of what I would say. It's like, I would say, no, I just say that's sort of like that's how sort of like what their argument implies. Like something isn't like a robot isn't designed if you can throw it into water and he'll die. It's like
so a design has to be perfect. Yeah, I've heard that argument that there's no design because look at our teeth and our backs. We're obviously not well designed. Yeah, and that's an interesting argument, but I don't think it doesn't mean anything because
I don't think Francis Collins buys into intelligent design either, depending how you want to look at it.
He does not. He does not.
I know he believes like an evolutionary creationism. I believe.
Yes, that's correct. That's right. He started the organization called Biologos. which has a great website. I would recommend people taking a look at it. Um, I agree with almost I know them very well. I've been involved with biologos for years. And I don't agree with everything, although it's a big tent. They have a lot of different points of view represented in their foundation and their website. Um, but for example, they believe that life evolved from chemistry, and that may be true. I honestly don't know. I tend not to doubt it. I think that life it's just too hard to come up with how that happened. And that's a whole nother discussion that I would have somewhere else with other people. But I wouldn't mind debating that with some other scientists, because the arguments to me are mostly scientific for the origin of life, and it's very hard to come up with a theory, even a theory that everyone can agree on, and that's telling us something. There's a clue there.
Well, I
So
mean,
anyway,
just remember, if there's many interpretations, that means it's not objective.
yeah, that's right. Because there's very little. There's just very little to go on. It's a very difficult problem, and I happen to think that. I don't really know, but I think that there was a divine intervention in the origin of life, just as there was a divine intervention in the origin of people and in the origin of the universe. Those three origins, to me, all had divine intervention. Now, how did that intervention come about? That would be nice to know. I would like to see if we could figure that out, but I don't know how to do it. I guess if I were younger, I would start looking into it, but at this point, it's a little hard.
Yeah, so I mean, I believe I remember it was funny when I was on Twitter with you and I seen how you were actually going against like someone in the like someone was arguing that there wasn't any like there was more than two biological sexes or something.
Wait a minute, I don't remember that. Somebody asked me how many biological sexes there are, chromosomal sexes. Right. And if I remember right, my answer it was and remains that uh, there are obviously XY and XX, which is male and female, but then because it's biology, there are always complications. And so you have intersex, where you could have chromosomal males who have an intersex issue because some hormonal signal did not get turned on at the development. So, in fact, they could end up with female organs as well. So there are some exceptions to that binary
Yeah,
sexuality.
hermaphrodites.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a series of syndromes. I don't know them all. I, I don't really know. I don't know much about that. I just kind of looked it up because somebody was asking me that, so I looked at it. But I mean, sexuality is a fluid issue in many organisms. I mean, in some insects, uh, sexuality is crazy. In fish as well. You get fish that turn from male to female depending on food supply and things like that. So mammals are a little bit more fixed than that, but you still get these abnormalities they're rare. They're pretty rare, but they do occur.
Like speaking as a biochemist, how do you look at the whole transgender issue?
Yeah, I like to stay away from that. It has nothing to do with biochemistry, thank God. And I just, I don't even know. I mean, there are people who are transgender. I mean, I've met them. I've known kids who I remember meeting when my son was small. He had a friend who was a boy, but boy, he really seemed like a girl, and he felt like a girl, and the parents felt like he was a girl, and everybody who saw him. So, I mean, these things happen, and I don't understand it. I don't know how it works. The genetics of sexuality are extremely complicated. They will probably never be understood because they have They don't have that much to do with physicality as they do with emotional and psychological issues. And, that interacts with environment, and that, that's one of those areas that will probably be resistant to any definitive answers from the laboratory for generations, if ever it'll ever be sorted out. I mean, what is normal sexuality? I don't know. I don't know. Who it doesn't exist probably. I mean, there's such a huge amount of variation, even within the so-called normal heterosexual population. Everybody has different strokes, as they say. So, that human. I don't know why. I mean, human sexuality is incredibly complicated, and I don't know if that's true for other animals. It might be, but it may have something to do with our brains and our all the things that make us human. Also, give us all these variations of ways of dealing with these things.
Since you
What I don't like is the political aspect of it, but that's a whole nother field. That's a whole nother subject, and that's because of my age, probably.
seeing as you used to be involved with the non sequitur treehouse club, how do you feel now that they've broken up?
Well, I'm sorry for that because I'm sorry they broke up. I was on the show 8 times. I counted.
Yeah, that one time they had that guy on that was debating Aaron Ra, and
Lou Jack. Yeah, don't remind me.
Like a Pokemon evolution. Like if I flap my arms like a bird.
He was a very nasty character. Actually, he was much worse than Kent Hovinder.
And then you had to jump in and save the day.
Well, I'm not sure I did that, but I was anyway. I don't want to. Yeah, I was on the show many times, and I thought it did a good job. I have been on for several months, and I think that's part of the change in direction.
Up until several months ago, at least,
Yeah,
2 years ago. Then it used to be a platform for ideas and have all this
yeah,
potential,
exactly.
but then they became more of an anti-Christian SJW shit show.
Well, I think Kyle was moving in that direction, although he never really said as much.
Yeah,
And
the group thinks
even Steve didn't know that, so how would we know that? But there was a sense when you think back in hindsight, in retrospect, you could sort of see this happening based on who was co-hosting, who was the guests, who were not the guests, what the subjects were, and it was going downhill. Now, I wouldn't say that, except that in retrospect, you can see that. But that's one issue, and I think the other issue is just the way it broke up was so bad, and like pretty much everybody. One of the things I tweeted up during this was one thing about the breakup of Non Sequitur show is it brought everybody together because I tweeted something in support of Steve, and I looked at who liked it, and it was half atheists and half Christians. So, I mean, like anybody who's connected with that show in terms of the audience, with a few exceptions, were all on Steve's side because Kyle just handled it so badly. And,
he's got toxic resentment issues and the group think just got to him.
That's right. That's right.
And
I like Kyle. He was a great guy. I have nothing against him. He was always very nice with me, kind with me. I think he did a good job. I frankly, like a lot of people, was shocked that this happened, and I tried to. There were many people.
He does live in an upside down universe where Jordan Peterson is a moron and God's engineer and his dumbass girlfriend are brilliant.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I even got along well with Godless Engineer. We had a couple of interactions that were not bad. So I don't know. I mean, I know I know the dean had a terrible time with him.
Yeah.
But that was an upsetting incident as well. But I don't know. I don't. We started out this show with me saying that politics is a terrible thing for science. I just think it's a terrible thing in general, to tell you the truth. Yeah. It's not good for personal interactions. It's not good for finding the truth. especially the politics that we're seeing in this country now, which is incredibly, I don't know what the word is, just
We're in clown
over
world.
the top. Well, sorry.
We're in clown world.
Yeah, it's just over the top, and Kyle himself has not been doing this up until fairly recently. I mean, he was not this way. Remember that Kyle had on a couple of really bad white nationalists, JF, and there was this other guy,
Even
and
even had a full blown Marxist.
yeah, and he was attacked for that, for having them on, and he defended the idea of platforming, as it was called, against a lot of people who are now on his side. So Kyle was not historically one of these, extreme folks who didn't want anybody to say anything that wasn't, approved. I don't know what changed. I honestly don't know. I'm confused. I don't know. All I know is that I don't think the future of the non sequitur show is very good. I think it's going to disappear.
I remember something that's funny that often gets brought up is where Jesus, like, so there's this conception that people say that where, if you're rich, you're going to hell because of Jesus. Jesus was said, said about the, oh yeah, he said it's easier for, it's hard
Camel
for
to
a rich,
go through a needle. Yeah.
yeah. Although, note I always bring up to them, I said, well, I guess you must believe, Jesus must have believed Abraham and David and Solomon were all in hell
Oh,
because
interesting. Right. And King
because
David.
they were all wealthy.
Oh, they were wealthy. That's true.
So no, like it wasn't wealth that was the sin. It was, if they were in love with it.
Hmm.
Like, David, Solomon, and Abraham, they had money, but they weren't in love with money.
Hmm.
Yeah,
They still acknowledged that they were sinful and they were grateful to God for having it.
Yeah, good point.
not like today's celebrities where they blow $25 million on a wedding and then only to get divorced within like a few months. Like, how many
Right.
starving kids could be fed with that money?
Yeah.
Oh, I remember it was funny is like because like people will say about the problem of evil, and I said you do realize much like for starving kids, for example, like anyone will say that they'll say, oh, starving kids is proof that God doesn't exist because of the problem of evil.
Hmm.
And I say you do realize that like 99% of the at least nowadays the cause of hunger, like the cause of child starvation is people, like governments. Like
That's
governments are preventing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
governments
true in
are.
a lot
Yeah,
of the many places in the world. Actually, starvation. Well, this the problem of evil is not one that I know the answer to, and it's not one that I can even talk about because
It's the only good argument that
it is
would have.
exactly right. It is a good argument, and we don't know the answer. I do know, however, and I actually published a book 12 years ago on this because my field was environmental science, and I wrote a book about what's been happening in the field of the environment, and in general, I also included other parts of human welfare. And to my surprise, I found out doing literary research, not scientific research, that things like nutrition and lifespan and general health have been improving continuously for a long time. The amount of malnutrition has actually been going down in most parts of the world, actually all the world. And with the fall of communism in Russia and Eastern Europe, the general quality of life has improved in the world in many places. That doesn't mean there still isn't terrible suffering, and there is, and probably will be for a very long time. But my point is that perhaps it's our job to deal with some of that suffering. It's not God's job. Perhaps this is one of the things that God assigned us to do, and I think Jesus told us that. I mean, it's not a mystery. He said, love your neighbor as yourself, and that includes taking care of your neighbor. So if we could actually do what Jesus, who is God, told us to do, That's our job, is to alleviate suffering. I don't think we can do it completely, but look at health. I mean, people talk about all the horrible diseases that humans have, and we do, but we have a lot fewer than we had 100 years ago, thanks to scientific research.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
And
apparently,
so,
yeah, and apparently they're going a long way with AIDS now.
oh yeah, I mean, AIDS is still there. It still is a bad disease, but it's not, doesn't have the fatality that it used to have. The same is true for many forms of cancer. I was a cancer researcher, so I know a lot about that. And a lot of other diseases are getting under control, and lifespan keeps going up. So, without even realizing it, we're kind of starting to live the commandment that we were given, which is to take care of each other and ourselves. And maybe that's the answer. I don't know if I'm not saying that's the answer, because I don't know, because there's still terrible evil that goes on that's probably beyond our control. And I don't know where that comes from, and I don't know the answer to it. But maybe there is an answer. I don't think it's without an answer.
All right, we're getting to Q&A time soon. You got any more questions for us?
No, I
Me?
was just
No,
going to
Brass.
that
Huh?
suffering is. Try watching. Can't. I was trying to say that if you want to know what suffering is, try listening to Kent Hovind talk about science for an hour. Then you'll know suffering.
Oh, I did that, and I did. You're right. that
Ken Hovind,
was,
Ken Hovind is hazardous to your health.
yeah. I didn't enjoy that debate at all. Let's put it that way.
Okay, Stepper says Ken Ham saying that creation is the gospel is simply dangerous.
Hmm.
Saint Knight says religion bad, atheism good. Theistic Logo says, what are your thoughts on the multiverse?
My thoughts?
Hmm.
Um, well, I think it's an interesting concept, which, as far as I know, and you really have to talk to somebody like Sarah Selyander, because I'm not an astrophysicist, but from what I know, it's a theory that is not testable. So it would explain things like fine tuning if certain parameters were correct. It might explain things like fine tuning, but it has no way. I mean, by definition, if there's a multiverse, then the universe, it's outside of our universe. Okay, so in other words, we may be one universe out of many in the multiverse, but we can't connect with those other universes, so we'll never know if they exist. I mean, I think it has some theoretical basis to it apparently, but I don't know enough physics to be able to explain what it
Stepper says we live in a supercomputer, and
is.
evolution began by God through quantum mechanics.
Okay.
He also says urination during fear causes you to move and run faster.
Say that again. You're what?
Stepper also says that urination during fear
Oh.
causes you to move and run faster.
Okay. He's got a theory too. I think it's just as good as my theory.
And he also says that chimps love to murder each other and cannibalize.
Well, they do that. I don't know if they love it, but they do it.
Not murder, because murder is a legal term. They kill each other,
They
but they don't
kill.
murder each other.
Good point. Yep.
Pig Swell Bucket asks, what is the worst atheist argument you've encountered?
Wow. There are a few. uh, I think the worst one is I won't believe in God until he's proven to exist. And that's a self-contradictory argument because, do you believe in, the example I always use is the IRS? Do you believe in the Internal Revenue Service? Does that even mean anything? Of course not. I mean, when something has been proven to exist, like the IRS, it doesn't mean anything to say you believe in it or you don't believe in it. It's real. It's there. It's not deniable. So I even wrote a somewhat amusing parable about what would happen if God actually proved his existence. And the result would be pretty much that no one would go to church anymore, and God would become just another one of those bureaucrats who tells people what to do. Because you know, why why would you pray to we don't pray to the president. We don't pray to people who who we know exist. I mean, so that would be the end of faith. So the idea that you don't believe in something until it's proven to exist is just very strange. And
I remember
I hear that a lot.
I remember Sarah Salviander wrote an article, a satire somewhere that where somebody made a computer simulation and it turns out that some of the program NPCs in there started to come to the conclusion that the computer designer didn't exist.
Yeah, I think I've seen that. Yeah.
I remember also a funny one that I hear from atheists all the time is, oh, well, you're only a Christian because you were brought up a Christian.
Yeah, well, I hear that, but I mean that one's easy for me because it's demonstrably not true. So, I just tell them, no, I wasn't brought up a Christian, quite the contrary.
All things pass away and all becomes new, says to Dr. Garte or anyone. Would you say perception or consciousness is one of those things that science can account for, like what you say about love?
Yeah, so consciousness is a fascinating field, which I got interested in at some point during all this transition I was going through, because one of the things I wondered about is what is consciousness? And turns out we don't even know how to define it. We can't even say what it is. Now, there are lots of theories, just like the origin of life. There are a lot of theories about consciousness. Daniel Dennett has said although it's complicated, but if I understand him properly, he says it's kind of illusionary. There's not really anything called consciousness. It's just we think there is, but there isn't. And I don't understand that. He's a brilliant guy. I think he's the smartest of all the new atheists. But I don't understand what he means. How can you think there's consciousness if there's no consciousness?
It
That
all,
is consciousness. I mean,
Well, I mean, he doesn't actually deny consciousness per se. He just doesn't think it's as important as people make it out to be.
yeah, I think that's right. I think you're onto it. He has used the word illusory, but I don't think he means it the way I don't think he means that he thinks it's fake. It's just it's like probably more like what you
all
said.
it boils down to is the chemistry in that gelatinous mass called your brain and the spinal cord.
That can't be true. That's not true because I mean I think that consciousness does originate in the brain, but you can't. It's not reducible. In other words, you can't say, okay, here's what conscious. I mean, we know already from neurology, from neuroscience, that there's no seat of consciousness. It's not. There's no part of the brain that makes you conscious. It's diffused throughout many parts of the brain.
Yeah.
So I think the only way to say it is that consciousness emerges as a new thing from the very complex, well, just put it mildly, the very complex neural interactions that go on in brains. But when you say the word emergence, you're really not saying anything. You're not explaining anything. You're just saying, biology emerged from very complex chemistry, but that also doesn't really tell us anything. So no, the answer is I have no idea. I like to think that consciousness is perhaps what it was that God blew into. I mean, I'm not saying that consciousness is the same as the soul, but I don't think you can have consciousness without a soul.
Or
So
would you
God,
say, or would you say the extent of one's soul would depend on their brain chemistry?
no, I don't think so.
No, I mean what kind of person they are, or if they're mentally handicapped or stuff like that.
Oh well, yeah. I mean, brain chemistry is part of that, sure. Um, And there are people with different degrees of consciousness. There are diseases where apparently one's consciousness is different, but there are also many conditions that people have, autism being the most famous, where there's no denial that the people are conscious. They have, in some cases, they have even a higher level of consciousness than other people, but their brain chemistry is not working the way it generally does. I mean, it's not normal. There's something wrong. So it's a complicated subject. I don't obviously I don't know the answer, but I definitely think that consciousness is an indication, and perception, as he said, perception of art, perception of many things, is an indication that we're not just simply animals that know how to walk and talk and use our hands. We're more than that.
Right. Art being the main thing that separates us, but old things pass away and all becomes new. Says, what would Dr. Garte say about chemistry's role in the mind, not brain, or if there isn't even a tie in there?
Again, I'm sure that chemistry plays a role because consciousness involves thought, and thought involves neurons firing, and involves synapses, and involves all these neural interactions. So yeah, but chemistry plays a role in all of life, in every part of life. But what I don't agree with is the reduction. Once you say that chemistry plays a role in all of life and in consciousness and in mental states, and then to say and that's all it is, that's the analogy I always use. Is that's like saying a Rembrandt is just a lot of paint. That's it. It's paint. So there's nothing else to a painting but the fact that it's made out of paint. Well, that's not true, obviously. So the creator who created a beautiful painting took the paint and did something with it that is creative. I mean, that's the whole meaning of the word. And did something that most other people can't do. And what I think is that that's what God does. God takes chemistry and he creates with it. He creates life, he creates consciousness, he creates some beautiful works of man.
Theistic Logos asks, what are your views on biblical inerrancy and Bible contradictions?
Oh boy. That's a tough one. I get into trouble when I say that I think the Bible is inerrant, because when I say the Bible is inerrant, I mean that what I don't mean, what I mean is that the Word of God is inerrant because God is God. But that doesn't mean that the written word that we have, which was translated several times and which was transcribed and which
Right.
came from the pens of human beings who were inspired by God to write them down, that doesn't mean that they didn't make any mistakes or they didn't contradict each other. Because remember, it's not one guy. It was 66 books. So that's a lot of writers.
Inspiration doesn't equal dictation.
Yeah, we don't know. And another thing, I have another parable. I think it might be in my book, which is, what God actually said and what the scribes wrote down. So, God could have said, in the beginning, there was a big bang singularity where, all matter was composed of, and on, and talked about the physics of what we now know today. And of course, the scribe just heard, well, I don't know what any of that means. So he just wrote, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. So we don't know. And you have to remember that these scribes who wrote the Bible were writing to their culture, not to ours. And I also think it's very presumptuous for us today to say, well, the Bible is wrong because now we know such and such. Well, yeah, but are we sure we're right? I mean, not even 100 years ago, we knew that the universe was steady state, past eternal. It had always been here and it always will be here, right? That was scientific knowledge. And it turns out, no, that's not correct. The universe had a beginning. And when that data was first presented, it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way because it sounded too much like Genesis. It got a lot of folks very upset. That's why it was called the Big Bang. So we don't, to say that we now know the truth and that doesn't correspond to the Bible is a little presumptuous. We don't really know yet what the truth is. And I think the real way to read the Bible is not, is it right? Is it wrong? Does it contradict? Yeah, you can find all of that as much as you want. The way to read the Bible, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm not making this up, I've heard this from very good theologians, is in the way it was intended. And that is not as a science book, not even as a history book, but as a series of books about God, about the creation, about the role of human beings, how we should treat each other, what we should do, what we shouldn't do. And some of those commandments are outdated. And luckily, Jesus knew that. And the early Christian fathers decided that, you could be a Christian without following every rule in the Old Testament. So that's where we are. So I think if you read the Bible that way, and not as an exercise in playing gotcha, you can do that, but it's silly, and it just basically confirms your own initial bias.
S.J. Thomason says the Bible has no provable contradictions. I disagree, but okay. Old things pass away and all becomes new. Asks, is morality reducible in any way?
Is morality reducible?
Yeah.
I guess I don't understand that.
I think they're maybe asking like in terms of trying to think how to word it, is like its relation with animals, like how they have more.
Oh, I see. Is morality reducible to scientific or evolutionary explanations, that kind of thing? You think that's what it is? What it means? I don't know what reducible means, because that is an argument I've heard that we're moral because it's evolutionarily favorable to be good to your.
Tell that to the piece of shit who stole my PS4.
Yeah, I guess he's more of an ape. But anyway, yeah, I mean, I think you could make the argument that, yeah, group selection and kin selection are real phenomena. And so there's some evolutionary pressure not to kill your relatives and certainly not your children, et cetera. And all that is fine. And it's what I said before. It's not all or nothing. That could be the basis for morality, but it only goes so far. And the kind of morality, the fact, for example, that human beings everywhere, every human being everywhere on the planet, no matter unless they're psychologically damaged and ill, knows that there's something called right and wrong, and that some things are right and some things are wrong. And what
to be a politician.
Say again?
Unless they try to be a politician.
No, they know too. Everybody knows. Everybody knows there's something right or wrong. They may not feel that they're doing the wrong thing, although everyone else might, but they know that there's something that's wrong. They know there's something called, there's good and evil, there's bad and good and bad. And I'm not sure there's any evidence that some animals may feel the same way. I think that some primates seem to indicate they know when they get guilty, and some dogs, will look guilty. It's very cute, but it's at a very, very surface level, and it's not the way we do. I mean, we think about it all the time, and so that sense of morality. And if you go back to Genesis, I mean, Adam and Eve, they felt shame, they felt guilt when they had eaten the apple and the tree of knowledge and knew that they were naked, etc. that's telling us something. That's telling us that this is part of being human, is that we understand that there is morality, and whether we all agree on what is good and what is bad, that's a different issue. And we don't, obviously. But we do all agree that there is such a thing, and that I think is uniquely human. But these are hard questions for a mere scientist, so I hope not too many more of this type.
S.J. Thomason says that is a good question. Can science explain morality? Is
Thank
our
you, SJ.
morality grounded in an explanation explained by evolution?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, I always point out like this, like evolution would tell you like how you came, like how like moral things developed, but it wouldn't tell you why you ought to continue doing it.
Right. Right. That's kind of what I'm saying. That's right.
Yeah, I mean, it would be like science could tell you that if a population just starts killing each other, they're not going to survive.
Right.
But it wouldn't be able to tell you, oh, why ought you not kill that person?
Well, it also wouldn't tell you why you shouldn't kill members of another group who are also human. In other words, if even Richard Dawkins, who has promoted this idea strongly, has said that the reason that we feel it's immoral to kill anyone, not just members of our own group, is because evolution, he calls it a spandrel. It was an evolutionary change that sort of took over and got extended out of control. But there's something also very important to say about evolution, which I should say now, and that's a scientific issue. And that is evolution is not simply natural selection. Okay. It's not if you do better with something that then that will be what you eventually evolve to do. It also involves, when we talk about biological evolution, it involves changes in the genes. It involves mutation. It involves um, genetic drift. It involves all kinds of various mutational effects. And those things take a huge amount of time to spread in the population. I'll give you an example. One place where we're still evolving is the ability to drink milk. At this point, I don't remember what the percentage is. I think it's a little bit more than half of the human population can drink milk as adults. And it's true in some areas of the world and less true in other areas of the world. And it's slowly spreading and will eventually take over the population. But it probably started 20,000 years ago or more. And it's taking that long, that just simple change in diet to spread through the population. And that's the rate at which evolution progresses, very, very slowly. We're talking about incredibly complex behaviors, which is not just one gene, as in the case of actually milk is more than one gene too. It's also very complicated. But when we're talking about behaviors like, being kind and being, generous and all these very complicated emotional behaviors, that's not going to evolve genetically in a few thousand years. That's going to take a million years to evolve. And we don't have any evidence that was true, a million, that thing started a long time ago. So
I don't like.
it's cheating to really say this is all evolution. It really doesn't work.
I just go for myself. G. Will says it might interest you to know that I just got ban hammered from a live chat on Mike Winger's channel for calling Godless Engineer brainless engineer.
Well, sorry to hear it.
Okay. Oh, I guess that's it.
Okay.
We should be wrapping up. Any more questions?
No, I'm good. I think this was a very nice talk. I'm glad to have Cy on.
Thank
Any
you.
project you're working on, and where can the dear audience find you?
Okay, so I have a blog which is called thebookofworks.com. One word, thebookofworks.com. I tweet every day, and my Twitter handle is @Garte. What else? The book, which I mentioned, will be available hopefully sometime in the next few months, and I will certainly publicize that. I'm also on Facebook, so I'm easy to find. I'm retired. I've been retired for 4 years now, and I'm pretty much devoting my life at this stage to um, the whole issue of science and religion, science and Christianity. I work at my church. I'm doing a lot of stuff. I heard that it's a good idea to keep active while being retired, and I'm certainly doing that. So I'm not bored. A lot going on. Oh, I'm also editor. I should say this. I'm the editor of a online magazine that's put out by the American Scientific Affiliation. That is an organization of Christians who work in science, and they have a journal which is called Perspectives in Science and Christian Faith. They also have an online magazine which is a little more informal, and I'm the editor in chief of that. And that comes out quarterly. The next issue will come out in mid-July. And if anyone's interested, if you look at my profile on Twitter, there's a link to that magazine. And if you really have an interest in science and faith, I would encourage you to consider sending in an essay or a poem or even a photo essay. We publish all kinds of stuff.
Okay.
All right.
Like, share, and subscribe. And thank my fans. Thank my trolls also. And see you next time.